Thank you very much indeed, President. Can I firstly thank Nina Gill for the work that she has done on this controversial and difficult file. I'd also like to compliment the other shadows that we've worked with. I'm a new member to the committee, but I read in detail the discussion that occurred in the last mandate at this committee. And I think it's fair to say, President, that there was more heat than light during those discussions, a lot of emotion, a lot of ideology thrown around the place. And I think the task, as the rapporteur has just said, for us all now, is to see if we can resolve this issue in the time frame that we have set out. And I think that will have a profoundly important effect were we to do that. If we bring forward a workable package, a proposal which deals with the systemic risk issue that Nina has spoken about, while at the same time resolving the fact that this is an industry of many different forms and that needs to be respected as well. If we can do that and have a package that is actually workable, I think Council will move very quickly in supporting that. I think actually they're waiting for us to actually bring some clarity to this issue. As I said at the start, President, this has been controversial, it's been a difficult file, but I think people, certainly the shadows now, are in a greater position, knowing what's at stake here, that we actually produce a position that is robust and strong. And what is at stake is quite straightforward, President. This is a €1 trillion industry in Europe. This money matters, as the rapporteur has said. It involves not SME lending, it involves lending to large corporates, it involves lending to NGOs, to government, to an emerging retail side. So this money matters. And in a circumstance where we're trying to use capital markets, where we're trying to use the liquidity we have in Europe to best effect, for us to take a disproportionate or unintended consequence conclusion to this, I think, in my view, could be very dangerous indeed. So I'm up for the task with other shadows in finding a compromise with Nina Gill and in finding a compromise with this committee, and I think the implications of that, President, will be profound in terms of moving this file forward and dealing with the risk issue, which I recognise is a concern. You know, we haven't had this issue, thankfully, in Europe. The only example where, as the Americans say, the buck was broken, albeit less than 1 cent, was in the United States of America, and that was a consequence of the Lehman's collapse. We haven't, thankfully, had an example of this in Europe, but we could. It might be a very small chance, and I think it is absolutely important for us as parliamentarians across the 28 member states of the Union to make sure that that doesn't happen and to make sure that the system we put in place is strong, is robust, but deals with these issues in a proportionate way so as to ensure that we get it right. Now, some of the amendments that I have put down on behalf of my group, and we have, as you say, over 700 amendments, a lot of amendments. I have amendments on instruments to address the risk associated with CNAVs, which I recognise, amendments on liquidity thresholds, credit ratings, diversification, transparency and eligible assets. And if I might briefly go through those, President. On the issue of the CNAV instruments, and as I've said before, regulating CNAVs out of existence is, in my view, not the way to go, because I believe that money would leave Europe. It would go to the east of us and to the west of us, but there are no certainties that it would stay in Europe. And in the circumstance where the European-wide economy faces right now, that would not make sense. So I recognise that both CNAVs and VNAVs play a fundamental part in the financing of parts of the European economy, and what we need to do is to regulate them effectively. While I ultimately think the best solution is to have CNAVs, liquidity fees and redemption gates, I've worked hard to come up with a new compromise package to move this regulation forward, as the rapporteur has said. Now this, my proposal, includes 3 types of new money market funds. Firstly, a retail CNAV, which is only available to charities, non-profit organisations and public authorities, and indeed to individuals. Secondly, a government money market fund which has to invest 99.5% of its assets in government securities. And just on that issue, President, at the moment, I think about 10% of the money market industry in Europe is in government paper, about 10% retail, but 80% institutional. That is totally different to the model in the United States of America, which has a much bigger retail dimension than a government dimension or indeed an institutional dimension. So when people compare us with the United States, they are not comparing like with like, and it is important to recognise that distinction. And then finally, I proposed a low volatility money market fund which will be available to all investors but would only be able to use amortised cost accounting for securities with a maturity of less than 90 days. For securities with maturities of greater than 90 days, valuation has to be done on a mark-to-market or mark-to-model basis. But both the retail CNAVs and the low volatility money market fund would be subject to a stringent system of liquidity fees and redemption gates, thereby preventing any first mover advantage, which was an issue that did come up in the roundtable discussions that we had. So you might describe my fundamental proposal, President, as fees and gates plus, and I think that is probably a fair enough assessment of what I am suggesting. Just briefly on liquidity, I have also increased daily liquidity thresholds from 10% to 15% and weekly liquidity thresholds from 20 to 30%. During our Shadows meeting with the SEC in the United States, we were informed that the most effective reform part of their package was actually the increasing liquidity, and it makes sense. If you have more money there, it's one of the greatest arguments against the shock issue, which colleagues have spoken about. But on this issue of liquidity, I'm open to finding a compromise with people to make sure that it works, and certainly we can look at that issue in greater detail. But I do think that the enhanced liquidity on a weekly and daily basis is one of the major reforms that we agree on, albeit at the percentage. On the issue of credit ratings, the Commission's proposal to prohibit external credit ratings would affect money market fund investments negatively. It is important that investors have a barometer by which to judge the quality and the liquidity of MFF holdings. I have included an amendment to permit external credit ratings for money market funds, but that such ratings should be subject to the requirements of the national competent authority of the rating agency. On diversification, I have also tabled amendments for stricter diversification standards, which would ensure that a money market fund should not have more than 5% of its assets invested in one single body. And stringent diversification requirements for both CNAVs and VNAV funds are also an important part of trying to mitigate risk. And we need to ensure that money market fund is not only overly invested in one single body, but on this issue, as on the argument on liquidity, and I want to make this clear, to the public, especially to our committee, I am open to finding a compromise on the question of diversification and liquidity, and I think something that works for both CNAVs and VNAVs. I very much agree with Nina on her remarks on transparency. I have proposed that money market funds should disclose to investors on a weekly basis the liquid levels of funds that exist, the portfolio of investments in the fund, and the average maturity of the fund. So transparency is a key issue for me. On eligible assets, I have proposed amendments that would allow money market funds to purchase certain high-quality asset-backed commercial paper that are of significance to the real economy, and I think that would make some difference. So I have proposed a package which I believe deals with the question of systemic risk, while also keeping in place this industry and moving it forward with certainty. And I think we need to see that package in its fullest possible light. And I hope we can come to an agreement. I think that will be important for the industry, for the future of financing in Europe, and especially for this Parliament. And I think we can get there with the kind of mix of policies that I have set out, and indeed others as well. Thank you, President.
Thank you. Next speaker, Mr. Kamal, ECR.